In short, when we look at different types of aesthetic images, we usually consider how they vary between different cultures. But if we put aside these cultural differences and focus on what's universal, we see that aesthetic images can be a language that everyone in the world understands. Art is a universal language. So, can we categorize these images? Absolutely. We can group them into four types: beauty, sublimity, tragedy, and comedy. In cultures where art has flourished, you'll find all four types. Chinese art, for example, includes beautiful and sublime images, as well as tragic and comedic ones. So, tragedy and comedy aren't just about literature, right? They're actually types of artistic expressions that go beyond just stories. When we talk about tragedy, it's not just about ancient Greek or Shakespearean plays. And comedy isn't just about slapstick humor. You can find comedic elements in paintings, music, and sometimes even in sculptures. But what about architecture? There aren't many examples of comedic architecture, but recently there have been a few. For instance, in our Pudong area, there's this three-piece set that has a comedic vibe to it. I see it every day, and sometimes it just strikes me as odd. What's the meaning behind it standing there? It's kind of ironic, don't you think? Alright, let's skip that for now. Instead, let's group these aesthetic images into four main categories. We'll start by talking about these four categories, which conveniently come in two pairs. First up, let's dive into the first pair, the beautiful and the sublime. The beautiful and the sublime, along with tragedy and comedy, have all been talked about in traditional aesthetics and are known as the four categories of aesthetic images. But you know what? It's not quite right to call them categories. Why? Because we only see the beautiful, the sublime, tragedy, and comedy as four different kinds of enjoyment that artworks give us. While we've got a taste for appreciating beauty, as well as a taste for the sublime, tragedy, and comedy, we can't fully pinpoint the recognition of artworks. When we step into the inner world of an artwork, the different types of aesthetic images that we can feel are what make up the various types of aesthetic images. So, in this sense, they should be called types of aesthetic images. Let's kick things off with the first pair. So, the beautiful is one type of aesthetic image, and its partner in crime is the sublime. But for now, let's zoom in on the beautiful. You know, when we talk about beauty in a narrow sense? That's what we're getting at here. It's the fundamental concept of aesthetic images in both ancient Chinese and Western aesthetic thoughts. We all naturally expect a piece of art to give us that good old enjoyment of beauty. But what does it really mean to enjoy beauty? It's about satisfying our craving for all things beautiful. Now, let's chat about this without getting too caught up in the technicalities of aesthetic images. When we say that the beautiful is a type of aesthetic image, what kind of inner vision brings it to life? Let's dive into that. From the perspective of inner vision, it's all about the genuine creative existence of a work, its creative existence. So, what kind of inner vision characteristics can create the aesthetic image of beauty? Describing these characteristics is a bit of a challenge. But in general, the inner vision that makes beauty possible should have features like harmony, tranquility, lightness, elegance, delicacy, and liveliness. These are just rough descriptions of these features. The pursuit of harmony has been a thing in art since the beginning of time. The Pythagorean school even believed that the whole universe is like a piece of music, following the common characteristic of harmonic proportions in all musical works. When it comes to sculpting the human body, we're also on the hunt for a kind of harmony. The most famous example is the golden ratio, a harmonious proportion that's often talked about as a characteristic of sensual beauty. But hey, I don't think it's a set type of aesthetic image. There are no hard and fast rules for the constitutive types of aesthetic images, so we should still focus on the basic characteristics we just talked about. So I gave an example using a poem. On page 113, let's take a look at Ouyang Xiu's 11th century CE poem. What do we feel when we read it? From the perspective of aesthetic image types, when we read lines like, "A light boat with short oars, the west lake is beautiful, the green water meanders. Fragrant grass grows along the embankment, faint sounds of flutes and drums follow everywhere. The water surface is smooth without breeze, the boat moves unnoticed. Slight ripples, startled waterfowl skim the shore and fly," we encounter various physical images such as the green boat, the green water, the long embankment, the sounds of flutes and drums, and so on. Then, within the language of this poem, these physical images are linked with the movements and stillness, creating an inner vision. What do we feel from this inner vision? Serenity, harmony, lightness, and elegance. It's as if we are placed in such a natural scene, completely in line with what? There's a painting in the poem, and this painting is beautiful. I also mentioned Guo Xiaochuan's, died 1976, poem, Autumn in Tuanbo Wallow, which is interesting because the first half is beautiful, and the second half is sublime. This doesn't mean that a work must be a single type of aesthetic image. Just like Beethoven's Symphony No. 5, we can feel the sublime beauty, but there are many passages that are beautiful. So, we need to remind ourselves that we can't simply categorize some works in a certain way. For example, Ouyang Xiu's Cai Songzi doesn't have anything sublime, it's all beautiful. But many great works cannot be easily classified. Its inner vision can only form a beautiful aesthetic image, while some passages can form the sublime. This cannot be generalized. We need to discuss it specifically. I'm not going to recite this long poem, you can read it. Can you describe the scene of Autumn in Tuanbo Wallow? I wrote an appreciation of it later. I said this about the first half of Guo Xiaochuan's poem. It vividly describes the rural scenery of China at that time, the peaceful wilderness and rivers, the land carried by generations of Chinese farmers, like a slow movement of a vast and melodious symphony, making people contemplate and immerse in a profound experience of selfless giving to the earth. My writing is obviously influenced by Heidegger, so the first half of this poem provides an internal perspective that allows us to form such an aesthetic image. The land of Chinese farmers, the tranquility of the Chinese countryside, the past beauty, is no longer present today. Today, the Chinese countryside has become hollow. A large amount of land has been deserted, and people have all gone to the cities to work. Many poems express their homesickness. The author's homesickness, in the midst of longing for his hometown, often uses the beautiful internal perspective. There are many such works, so what does beauty mean? It means our affirmation of the real world, an affirmative experience. A person who fundamentally takes a negative attitude towards life and the world cannot discover beauty, there is no doubt about this. But beauty? It does not mean something that actually exists in the real world. In fact, it is a transcendental understanding of our freedom, which can be affirmed in certain external scenes of the world. So what should we introduce into the discussion of the types of aesthetic images? In terms of the most correct human life experiences, there are 4 types of aesthetic images. Well, there are also 4 types of human life experiences, which correspond to them. We have tragic experiences, comic experiences, sublime experiences, and beautiful experiences. In this 3rd lecture, we're diving into a really interesting topic, the connection between a nation's unique artistic style and how it relates to art on a global scale. It's pretty clear that a nation's way of life and culture is the breeding ground for its art. Each nation, based on its cultural spirit and life experiences, develops a distinct understanding of the world that sets it apart from others. This uniqueness is embedded in its language, like Chinese. Everyday words in Chinese, as long as they reflect our cultural spirit, such as the basic ideas of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, just can't be translated into European languages. In our Chinese language and the experiences of the Chinese people, this kind of worldview definitely shows up in our nation's art. Remember when we talked about Zhong Baihua's comparison of Western and Chinese painting last time? He explained that when we look at Western paintings, our eyes travel from far to near and then to the far again, almost reaching the infinite horizon, pointing upwards as if to the heavens. But in Chinese landscape painting, the viewer's gaze goes from far to near, until it reaches the foot of the mountain, the riverbank, taking in everything and finding joy in the experience. You can see that these directions are totally opposite. The different ways Western and Chinese paintings use space reflect the unique artistic spirits of each nation, including their philosophy, their fundamental understanding of the world, and their experiences. This is a clear example of how different national arts are rooted in their respective cultures. But art is also a universal language. Chinese people paint, Westerners paint, and people from other nations paint. As long as it's a painting, it doesn't need translation. We can appreciate a painting at a glance, whether it's Western or Chinese. We call this painting art. Yep, there's no doubt about it. If we listen to a piece of music, whether it's composed by a European or a Chinese, we're entering a shared world of music, a common art form. The differences between nations lead to different ways of receiving the same musical work. This difference is actually a really important thing, it's mutual inspiration. Mutual inspiration is a great thing because art is the pursuit of truth. Any nation involved in artistic creation is on the path of truth, inspiring each other. Just like mutual inspiration happens in the fields of philosophical and religious thought. The ideas of Buddha inspired Chinese thought, leading to Zen Buddhism, and later the Neo-Confucianism of the Song and Ming dynasties. Philosophy works this way, and so does art. So, as we were saying last time, we confirmed that each nation has its own unique aesthetic style, but at the same time, we also acknowledged that art is a universal language. However, in the world of literature, there's a pretty big gap. Translating isn't impossible, but when we translate a Tang poem into English, we lose a lot, don't we? Nevertheless, we still inspire each other, just like how modern Chinese poetry has been heavily influenced by European poetry. We've translated a bunch of European poems, from the classics to modern works, and even some impressionist poetry. Through this translation process, the Chinese language has quietly evolved. We've started to move towards a more everyday language in our poetry, breaking free from the rules of traditional verse. The modern poetry movement has definitely been shaped by European poetry. Despite the big gap in the literary world, there's still been a lot of exchange, mutual inspiration, and mutual encouragement between different nations in the field of literature. So, in our third lecture, we talked about these things. If we put aside the differences in how different countries see beauty and just focus on what they have in common, we can break down aesthetic imagery into 4 types. These types represent the clashes between beauty and the sublime in the art of different nations, as well as the clash between tragedy and comedy. It's just that when it comes to tragedy, the Chinese don't really go all in on the tragic stuff. Even though there are some tragic works, they usually end in a way that gives our heart some comfort, without that complete tragedy vibe. Take Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, for example. It's a tragedy of an unfixable fate. You know, the whole killing your dad and marrying your mom deal. In the history of Chinese art, we haven't really nailed that complete tragedy thing. There was a novel called Dream of the Red Chamber that had a really strong tragic vibe, but it kind of lost it in the last 40 chapters, which Gaoei wrote. What did that add to the Chinese sense of tragedy? Well, it gave a comforting conclusion in the end, right? But it still didn't fully deliver that tragic punch. I'm using this example to show that in important literary works, there have been distinctions between beauty, the sublime, tragedy, and comedy, but the degree of each can vary. So, we're diving into a discussion of these four basic types, which actually form two pairs, right? Beauty and the sublime make one pair, and tragedy and comedy make another pair.